Welcome everyone to the week 3 presentation for ME121. Let's dive right in. This week we are focusing on 2 chapters, Chapter 4, which is the skeletal system, and Chapter 5, the muscular system. All right, let's start with some functions of our skeletal system. Some good things to remember before we list off these is bones are very active living tissues. So each bone is made up of several types of tissue, bone, cartilage, even dense connective tissue, blood, and nervous tissue. And so it's considered an organ. The bone functions include muscle attachment, protection, support of soft tissues, blood cell production, which is hemopoiesis, and the storage of inorganic salts. Some histology. So the expanded ends of bones that form joints with adjacent bones are called the epiphysis. The shaft of the bone is known as the diaphysis, and the tough layer of vascular connective tissue that surrounds or covers the bone, that's called the periosteum. And its covering, the periosteum, is actually continuous with ligaments and tendons. The diaphysis, which again is the shaft of the bone, contains a hollow medullary cavity. It's lined with endosteum and it's filled with bone marrow. So compact bone, this is what makes up the wall of the diaphysis or the shaft of the bone. Compact bone, which is dense and hard, is found near the surface of the bone where great strength is needed. The epiphysis are filled with spongy bone to reduce the weight of the skeleton. The spaces between the spongy bone or within the spongy bone are filled with bone marrow. So that's important to remember. The space within spongy bone are filled with bone marrow. Let's look more microscopically. So bone cells are known as osteocytes. They're located within haversian canals. The osteoblasts produce bone by secreting collagen. That's important to remember. Extracellular matrix of bone consists mainly of collagen and inorganic salts. The collagen provides strength and resilience. The inorganic salts provides hardness and a resistance to crushing. Blood vessels that nourish the bone tissue pass through the haversian canals. That's an important piece to know. Looking next at bone growth, we know our bones grow. We are not the same size as an infant as we are as an adult, so our skeletal structure has to grow with us. Metaphysis are growth centers. And you can see on the x-ray here where the arrows are, those little spaces as seen in the bone. And here we're looking at our femur and then our tib fib. So this is our knee that we're looking at. And we have what's considered an anterior or posterior view on the left and a lateral view on the right. So the metaphysis are growth centers that disappear at maturity, becoming vague epiphyseal lines. So they will just close together and make just a really thin, almost pencil line on the radiograph as the person ages. Looking at what's what, our skeleton can be divided into 2 parts, the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. So the axial portion protects the organs of the nervous, respiratory, and circulatory systems. The appendicular portion makes movement possible, protects organs of digestion, excretion, and reproduction. Within our upper extremities, we have the shoulders, arms, forearms, wrists, and hands. And then our lower extremities contains the bones for our hips, thighs, legs, ankles, and feet. The axial skeleton consists of bony and cartilaginous parts that support and protect the head, neck, and trunk. So the skull is comprised of both the cranium and the facial bones. The hyoid bone supports the tongue and aids in swallowing, and then we have our vertebral column and our thoracic cage, which is generally speaking our ribs and sternum. The appendicular skeleton consists of the bones of the upper and lower limbs and the bones that anchor the limbs to the axial skeleton. It includes the pectoral girdle, the clavicle, and the scapula. The upper limb, which is our humerus, ulna, radius, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges, and our pelvic girdle, which is our 2 hip bones. The lower limbs, that's our femur, patella, tibia, fibula, tarsals, metatarsals, and phalanges. So let's break it down a bit more. Here on this slide, you can see the skull has 8 cranial bones. That's important to know. 14 facial bones. That's also important to know. And then inside your ear, there's actually 3 auditory ossicles, or 3 ears or bones inside your ear. The thoracic cavity, again, our ribs and sternum. Our shoulder, generally speaking, is our clavicle, scapula, and then sometimes the humerus is included in the shoulder. The arm, definitely the humerus, radius. The radius is the lateral bone of our forearm, and the ulna is our medial bone of our forearm. Our wrist, hands, and fingers. Our wrist is our carpals. Our hand is made up of our metacarpals, and finally our fingers are phalanges. The spinal column. 26 vertebrae total, but that can be divided down. We have 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, a sacrum, and a coccyx. Our pelvis is comprised of our ilium, ischium, and pubic bone. Our leg is made up by the femur, patella, tibia, and fibula. Our foot is made up of our talus, calcaneus, tarsals, metatarsals, and again, our toes are also called phalanges. It's important to know, because your quiz asks you this, the upper and lower limbs each have 28 phalanges. Next, let's look at the skull in more detail. So, the skull is made up of 22 bones total, 8 cranial bones, and 14 facial bones. That is important. Again, we also have the 3 bones of the middle ear. The cranium is what encloses and protects the brain, provides attachment for muscles, and contains the air-filled paranasal sinuses. Definitely remember that. The sinuses reduce the weight of the head and increase vocal resonance. The frontal bone features the supraorbital foramina and the frontal sinuses. The parietal bone makes up the sides of our skull. The occipital bone forms the back of the skull and the base of the cranium. The temporal bones form part of the sides and the base of the cranium. The sphenoid bone helps form the base of the cranium, the sides of the skull, and a portion of the orbits. The ethmoid bone is located in front of the sphenoid bone. And then let's look at our facial skeleton. 13 immovable bones and 1 movable lower jaw, making 14 total. The maxilla forms the upper jaw. That's important to remember. It also forms part of the hard palate, the floor of the orbits, and the sides of the nasal cavity, and it houses the teeth and contains a large maxillary sinus. The palatine bones, these are L-shaped bones. They're located behind the maxilla, and they form part of the floor and the lateral wall of the nasal cavity, and also the posterior portion of the hard palate. Zygomatic bones, these form our cheekbones and the lateral walls of our orbit. The lacrimal bones form part of the medial wall of the orbit, and our nasal bones, those are what make the bridge of our nose. The vomer bone makes up a portion of the nasal septum. The inferior nasal conch, these are really fragile scroll-shaped bones, and they support mucous membranes in the nasal cavity. And last but not least, we have our mandible. That is our lower jawbone. It supports the lower teeth and includes the mandibular condyle, the condyloid process, and the alveolar arch. Looking next at our vertebral column. So, our vertebral column is composed of bony vertebrae that are separated by fibrocartilaginous intervertebral discs. It's held together by ligaments. It extends all the way from the skull down to the pelvis. It supports the head and trunk, protects the spinal cord, and the vertebral canal that the spinal cord passes through. One thing I want you to note, the neural arch, it's Neural arch, That's the posterior curved region of the vertebra. That is important to remember. Your cervical vertebra is the first 7 bones. It comprises the neck and it supports the head. The first vertebra has a special name called atlas. It supports the head. The second vertebra has a special name called axis. You have 12 thoracic vertebrae. They do articulate with the ribs. And you have 5 very massive lumbar vertebrae that support the weight of the body and are located in the small of your back. Let's talk about some joints next. Okay, so some terminology regarding joints. The joint capsule is made of tough, fibrous connective tissue and it surrounds the joint. Ligaments and tendons are often confused. Ligaments are bands of connective tissue that hold bones together at joints. Tendons are muscles that attach to bones by bands of connective tissue. A fossa. When you hear that word, I want you to think of a depression on the surface of a bone. Bones often have different depressions based on what passes through that area to make room for it. Our skeleton is very uniquely designed. Looking more specifically at joints, there are 6 types of synovial joints. Ball and socket, hinge, pivot, gliding, saddle, and condyloid. Those are good to know as well. 6 types of synovial joints. Moving on to skeletal muscle. When we think of our skeletal muscles, we need to think that these muscles are voluntary. These are voluntary muscles that attach to bones. So each skeletal muscle is an organ made up of hundreds, sometimes even thousands, of muscle cells referred to as muscle fibers. Even when we are not moving, our muscles are in a state of partial contraction. That's what gives us muscle tone. Insertion versus origin. Insertion is the attachment of the muscle to a more movable bone. The origin is the attachment of the muscle to a less movable bone. Fascicles, these are muscle fiber bundles. That's important to remember. Myofibrils, these are thread-like structures that almost fill muscle fibers. Striations, we can see muscle striations when we look at the skeletal muscles. They're produced by overlapping myosin and actin filaments that make that pattern of bands on our muscles. Okay, next it goes through the sequence of events of a muscle contraction, and this you can definitely read from your book. But there are a couple of high points that I definitely want you to key in on. Acetylcholine is a neurotransmitter that's released by a motor neuron. That is definitely one key I want you to remember. A motor neuron, what that is, that's just a nerve that controls muscle contractions. So a motor nerve controls muscle contractions. Excessive acetylcholine is broken down by an enzyme called acetylcholine esterase. And that is a big long word. Acetylcholine esterase. The other term I want you to remember is ATP, and you'll see it on number 4 there. Adenosine triphosphate. It's an immediate source of energy for muscle contraction. Let's next talk about muscle fatigue. Hopefully I'm not the only one who has felt muscle fatigue in my life. I used to run a lot. I haven't done as much as I used to, but I used to run half marathons. And so muscle fatigue can be a problem, especially if you are one that exercises a lot, and it's good to know what causes it. During vigorous exercise, muscle cells can break down glucose without oxygen. So if we're doing it without oxygen, it's anaerobically. A waste product is produced called lactic acid, and that is what causes muscle fatigue. So during exertion, muscle fibers incur an oxygen debt, so they don't have enough oxygen, which is paid back during periods of rapid breathing following strenuous exercise. So it's important to remember that lactic acid is a waste product produced during anaerobic metabolism of glucose. Looking next at some principal muscles in the body, and this figure did come from your book, figure 5-7 and figure 5-8. So I know the labels are too small on here to read, but you can definitely look this up in your textbook and follow along. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all of these muscles. I would make yourself familiar with them because it is good base knowledge for you to get in your head. However, I will tell you the most important ones for your quiz. Zygomatic muscle, that elevates the upper corners of your mouth. If you can remember the zygomatic bone is found in your cheek, then you can probably remember it's somewhere on the face and that it does something that would have to do with your face. Masseter muscle, that's important in chewing. The masseter muscle, sometimes you can feel it at kind of the angle of your jaw right in front of that. Gluteus maximus, usually we're familiar with this one already. It's the muscle that extends and rotates the thigh laterally and tilts the pelvis. Biceps brachii, that is what flexes the elbow. Another term I want you to know is synergist. Synergists are muscles that stabilize joints. All right, my friends, this concludes the highlights of your chapters for this week. Definitely make sure you do read through both chapters, chapter 4 and 5, in detail. As always, if you have questions, concerns, need additional assistance, anything like that, I'm always here to help you. Thank you so much for your time. And do remember, all of the information presented today did come from your textbook. Have a great week.